no schedule, no homework, no school bell. So how did prehistoric children actually learn anything at all? You probably assume children need structured classrooms, organized curriculums, and constant adult supervision to grow into capable adults. For roughly 300,000 years, none of that existed, and yet every single generation of humans successfully learned everything they needed to survive. There was no kindergarten, no standardized testing, no homework assignments, no parent-teacher conferences, no bell schedules dividing the day into subjects, and somehow children still grew up knowing how to hunt, gather, build shelter, read weather patterns, and navigate complex social relationships. So what did learning actually look like before institutions decided childhood needed to be managed, scheduled, and constantly evaluated? Let's start with the single most striking fact anthropologists have documented about hunter-gatherer childhood across dozens of different cultures worldwide. Children learned almost entirely through observation and play, watching adults closely and imitating their actions without any formal instruction whatsoever. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett spent years studying the Aka people of Central Africa and documented something remarkable about how their children acquired skills. By age 3, Aka children were already handling small knives safely, something that would horrify most modern parents watching from a distance. But here's the key detail that changes everything about how we should interpret that fact. These children weren't handed knives and left alone. They learned gradually, watching older children and adults use tools first, then practicing with supervision that faded naturally as competence increased. This is called the apprenticeship model of learning, and it's almost the complete opposite of how modern children are taught nearly everything today. Instead of sitting in rows, facing forward, listening to someone explain a concept abstractly, children watched real tasks being done by real people in real time. Anthropologist David Lancy, who has spent decades studying childhood across hundreds of cultures, found that this pattern repeats almost everywhere outside industrialized societies. Children are rarely taught directly through verbal instruction. Instead, they are present during adult activities and absorb skills through sustained, repeated observation. A child watching their mother weave a basket for the 40th time isn't being bored. They're building a deep, embodied understanding of the entire process. Compare that to how a modern child might learn about basket weaving from a worksheet, a video, or a single rushed demonstration with no real practice. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost unbelievable to modern parents: the sheer amount of unsupervised free play hunter-gatherer children experienced daily. Anthropologist Peter Gray has extensively documented that hunter-gatherer children spent the overwhelming majority of their waking hours engaged in completely self-directed play. Not play organized by adults with rules and referees, but genuinely free play, chosen entirely by the children themselves, with minimal interference from grown-ups. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, children as young as 4 or 5 roam in mixed-age groups, often venturing well beyond where any adult can see them. This might sound dangerous, even negligent, by modern parenting standards that emphasize constant visual supervision and structured, adult-organized activities for safety. But Gray's research suggests something counterintuitive. This freedom wasn't neglect, it was actually the primary mechanism through which children learned to manage real risk. When children climb trees, handle tools, navigate unfamiliar terrain, and resolve their own conflicts without adult intervention, they develop genuine competence and confidence. A child who has never been allowed to assess risk on their own has no internal framework for judging danger when an adult isn't watching. Mixed-age playgroups were another defining feature of prehistoric childhood, something almost entirely absent from how modern children typically spend their time today. In hunter-gatherer bands, children of vastly different ages, sometimes from 2 years old to 12, played together in the same loose, unsupervised groups. Older children naturally taught younger ones, not because any adult assigned them that responsibility, but because mixed-age groups organically generate informal mentorship relationships. A 7-year-old teaching a 4-year-old how to identify edible plants is learning just as much as the younger child, reinforcing their own knowledge through teaching. Compare that to modern schooling, where children are almost always grouped by exact birth year, surrounded only by peers at the identical developmental stage. This age segregation, while seemingly logical for academic instruction, removes the natural mentorship dynamic that defined nearly all human childhood for hundreds of thousands of years. So, what about discipline? Surely, children needed strict rules, punishments, and constant correction to learn proper behavior and respect for elders and authority figures. Remarkably, anthropological records suggest hunter-gatherer societies relied far less on punishment and far more on modeling gentle correction and natural social consequences. Among the Juhansi studied extensively by anthropologists, children were rarely physically punished, and corporal punishment was considered shameful rather than an acceptable parenting tool. Instead, children learned acceptable behavior largely by watching how adults treated each other and by experiencing the natural social consequences of their own actions directly. If a child took more than their share of food, the community's mild social disapproval taught the lesson far more effectively than any formal punishment could. This doesn't mean these societies had no rules or expectations, but the entire framework for teaching those expectations looked completely different from modern disciplinary structures. There was no concept of timeout, no removal of privileges, no structured punishment system designed to enforce compliance through fear or controlled consequences. Now let's address something that troubles many modern parents deeply: the issue of safety, danger, and how children avoided serious harm without constant supervision. The honest answer is that some children did get hurt, and child mortality rates were genuinely higher than in modern industrialized societies with medical infrastructure. But the specific causes of injury and death looked different than most people assume, and freedom of movement wasn't actually the primary danger involved. Researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies found that most serious childhood injuries stemmed from disease and infection, not from unsupervised exploration or independent play. In fact, children who were given more independence and allowed to develop practical skills early often showed better risk assessment than children kept under constant supervision. A child who has practiced climbing trees since age 3 develops genuine physical competence and spatial awareness that a sheltered child simply never gets the chance to build. This connects to a fascinating concept psychologists now call competence through autonomy, the idea that real skill develops through actual practice, not protective restriction. Anthropologist Jean Liedloff, who lived among the Yaquana people in Venezuela, documented children who were remarkably self-assured, calm, and capable compared to children from industrialized backgrounds. She argued that the constant adult intervention, typical in modern parenting, actually undermines a child's developing sense of competence rather than protecting it effectively. Every time an adult rushes to prevent a child from attempting something slightly risky, the child receives an implicit message that they are incapable of judging risk themselves. Over generations, this pattern can create exactly the kind of anxious, dependent behavior that many modern parents are desperately trying to avoid in their own children. Let's talk about teaching specific survival skills, because hunting, tracking, and gathering required genuinely sophisticated knowledge that took years to fully develop and master. Anthropologists studying Zisan people of the Kalahari documented that boys often didn't become fully competent hunters until their late teens or even early 20s. But this wasn't because formal instruction was slow or inefficient. It was because true mastery requires thousands of hours of gradual, hands-on practice over time. A young boy might start by simply accompanying hunters, carrying water, watching tracking techniques, asking questions, and slowly absorbing an enormous body of practical knowledge. By his early teens, he might be allowed to throw a spear at small, stationary targets, building physical skill alongside the deeper conceptual knowledge already absorbed. Only after years of this gradual apprenticeship would a young man be trusted to participate in an actual hunt with real consequences and real risk involved. This entire process looks remarkably similar to what modern educational researchers now call scaffolded learning, gradually increasing complexity and independence as competence genuinely develops. The crucial difference is that prehistoric scaffolding happened organically through real-world participation, not through artificially designed worksheets disconnected from any actual practical application. Girls in many hunter-gatherer societies followed a parallel apprenticeship path, learning to identify hundreds of plant species, their seasons, their uses, and their dangers. Anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden studied Hadza girls and found they began contributing meaningfully to gathering activities as early as age 5, learning through direct, supervised participation. By their early teens, these girls possessed botanical knowledge that would rival many university-trained botanists, acquired entirely through years of hands-on practical experience. This knowledge wasn't memorized from a textbook or tested through an exam. It was deeply embodied, practical, and immediately useful in their daily survival. Now compare this entire system to how most modern children spend the majority of their formative years inside age-segregated classrooms, learning largely abstract, disconnected information. A child today might memorize the names of plants from a textbook without ever touching, smelling, or tasting them, learning facts entirely disconnected from direct experience. This isn't necessarily worse in every single way. Modern education provides genuinely valuable knowledge that wouldn't exist within a purely hunter-gatherer framework of learning. But something significant was lost in the transition from apprenticeship-based learning to institutionalized, age-segregated, classroom-based education that emerged with agricultural and industrial societies. The shift began roughly 10,000 years ago, alongside agriculture, when children's labor became economically valuable for tending crops, animals, and household production tasks. Formal schooling, as we recognize it today, is an even more recent invention, emerging widely only within the last few hundred years alongside industrialization and factory labor. Compulsory education was partly designed to prepare children for factory work, requiring them to sit still, follow rigid schedules, and respond to external authority for hours daily. This historical context matters because much of what feels like the natural way to educate children is actually a relatively recent cultural and economic invention. Today's hyper-scheduled childhood, filled with structured activities, constant supervision, and minimal unstructured free time, represents an extreme departure from how humans evolved to develop. Psychologist Peter Gray has extensively documented a measurable decline in children's free, self-directed playtime over the past several decades in industrialized nations. Simultaneously, researchers have documented rising rates of childhood anxiety, depression, and what some psychologists call a crisis of independence among modern children and teenagers. Gray argues these trends are directly connected, that the dramatic reduction in autonomous play correlates strongly with declining mental health outcomes among young people today. This doesn't mean we should abandon modern education entirely or send children unsupervised into the wilderness. That comparison oversimplifies a genuinely complex situation, but understanding how childhood actually functioned for the vast majority of human history offers valuable insight into what children's brains and bodies evolved to expect. Children evolved to learn through observation, imitation, mixed-age mentorship, gradual increasing responsibility, and substantial unstructured free play, not isolated desks and standardized testing. Modern parents, juggling packed schedules of extracurricular activities, tutoring sessions, and structured enrichment programs, might be unintentionally working against deeply evolved developmental needs. A child constantly shuttled between adult organized activities rarely experiences the kind of self-directed exploration that built confidence, competence, and resilience for hundreds of thousands of years. The constant adult supervision so common in modern parenting, while well-intentioned and rooted in genuine safety concerns, removes opportunities for children to develop independent judgment. Hunter-gatherer parents weren't negligent. They trusted their community, their environment, and, crucially, their children's developing capabilities far more than most modern parents typically do. That trust was reinforced by an entire social structure, the same alloparenting network we discussed before, where many adults watched over children collectively throughout each day. A child wandering slightly beyond their mother's direct sight wasn't actually unsupervised. They were within a web of community members who would notice if something went wrong. This distributed supervision model allowed individual parents to relax constant vigilance while children still remained genuinely safe within an interconnected, watchful community network. Modern nuclear families, often isolated from extended family and community support, frequently can't replicate this distributed supervision leading to either constant individual vigilance or genuine risk. This helps explain why modern parenting often feels so exhausting. Parents are attempting to provide both supervision and stimulation that used to be distributed across many adults. Understanding this history doesn't provide simple, easy answers for modern families, but it does offer valuable perspective on which struggles are genuinely new and recent. The exhaustion many parents feel isn't a personal failure. It's the predictable result of trying to raise children within a fundamentally different, more isolated social structure. Some modern educators and parents have begun experimenting with elements of this older approach, creating mixed-age play environments, reducing structured scheduling, and trusting children with more autonomy. Forest schools, unschooling movements, and free play advocacy groups are essentially attempts to recapture elements of childhood that existed for the vast majority of human history. These movements remain controversial and aren't universally embraced, but the underlying anthropological evidence about how human children evolved to learn is difficult to ignore entirely. For roughly 300,000 years, children learned everything they needed through watching, playing, gradually increase responsibility, and being embedded within a wide, supportive community network. No bell schedules divided their days into rigid subjects. No standardized tests measured their progress against arbitrary benchmarks. No helicopter parent hovered anxiously nearby, and somehow, generation after generation, children grew into fully capable adults, possessing extraordinarily sophisticated practical knowledge about their environment, their tools, and their community relationships. The modern world has gained enormous advantages through formal education, literacy, scientific knowledge, and structured learning that wouldn't exist within purely traditional societies. But perhaps something valuable was also left behind: a deep trust in children's capability, a tolerance for risk, and a community-wide approach to raising the next generation. Your ancestors didn't have parenting books, developmental milestones charts, or anxiety about whether their child was being stimulated correctly every single moment of every day. They simply lived alongside their children, modeled the skills that mattered, and trusted an entire community to help raise every single child toward genuine, practical competence.